Hey gang, Neil from Alpine Endurance here. The purpose of this video is to talk about thresholds, how to identify them, and what metric is best used to monitor them during your training and racing. And a bit about my history with lab testing, you guys. So my knowledge that I'm speaking about here is coming from direct experience. I have a kinesiology degree, and I've been a test subject at the University of Calgary's Human Performance Lab on 6 different studies and well over 30 visits to the lab. And I've done probably 12 to 15 VO2 max tests in both cycling and swimming. Okay, team. So we're going to clear up confusion around the various names that our 2 thresholds have. So everyone has 2 thresholds. And we can see here on our simple graph, workload at the bottom x-axis. So that could be cycling power, that could be running speed, generally how much effort are we putting out. We then get a corresponding physiological response on the y-axis. And that physiological response can be measured many ways: heart rate, lactate, breathing rate, RPE, rate of perceived exertion, just how hard do you think you're working. But they're all measuring the same 2 things. And those 2 things are the first ramp up in your physiological response as you're doing increasing work, and that second ramp up. Those are your 2 thresholds. AT1, commonly called aerobic threshold. AT2, commonly called anaerobic threshold. They go by a lot of different names, which we'll get into in a sec here. So below our aerobic threshold, that's what we call our green zone here at Alpine Endurance. And on a Garmin traditional 5-zone model, that's going to be zones 1 and 2. Yellow zone in between our 2 thresholds, that's going to be zone 3. And the red zone above anaerobic threshold, that's zones 4 and 5. For us as endurance athletes, the key thing that our thresholds are delineating is fuel source and what metabolic pathway is our body using to convert that fuel source into ATP, which is what our muscles need to perform work. So in the green zone, we're using predominantly fat. It produces a large amount of ATP. It does so very slowly, and it does so without producing lactate. Very sustainable thing, hours and hours on end, and multiple days in a row. It's very easy to put out that effort. Yellow zone, we're using a mix of fat and carbohydrate, glycogen, and other glucose sources. And then above AT2, we're using predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly muscle glycogen, which can produce ATP really quickly, but produces a lot of lactate as a result. And breathing in these different zones. So the green zone, we're going to be able to nose breathe for minutes at a time. We can talk in complete sentences. If a friend were to call you on a phone during your green workout, they could tell that you were exercising, but you could absolutely carry on that conversation. Our aerobic threshold, AT1, marks where we now have to switch to mouth breathing in the yellow zone. And we can talk in a few words at a time, but not complete sentences. And then above AT2, and we are maybe a single word here and there that we could get out. We're full mouth breathing, concentrated, a diaphragm, a belly coming in and out. We're working quite hard. Okay, team. So, a definition of aerobic threshold, AT1, a dividing line between a sustainable and non sustainable exercise output, an effort you can hold for hours and hours, the point at which one's breathing first makes a marked increase. The exercise intensity at which lactate begins to accumulate in the blood at a low rate but is easily cleared. And when we say cleared, lactate is actually a super valuable fuel source that, if you have aerobically trained slow twitch muscles, they can use lactate as a fuel source. The exercise intensity at which lactate begins to accumulate in the blood at a low rate but is easily cleared. Below AT1, fat is the primary fuel source. Above AT1, a mix of fat and carbohydrates, glycogen, etc., is used. And a key point there, you guys, if you are, multi-day enduro racers or your backcountry skiers who are looking to perform day after day after day, this is why you want to do a lot of aerobic training so you can raise your AT1. If you're operating in that green fat burning zone, you have, from an exercise perspective, basically unlimited fat supplies. And so to do that effort then again the next day, it's no problem. You have all this fat stores to use and it's fine. If you're one of those people who you haven't done dedicated green aerobic training and you have a low aerobic threshold and you're always kind of operating in that yellow zone, you're depleting your glycogen. And that can take up to 48 hours to fully replenish your glycogen stores. And so if you want to do an effort the next day, good luck, because you're not going to have replenished your glycogen stores in time. Anaerobic threshold, AT2, an output you could hold for 1 hour if you absolutely had to. So AT2 is marking the upper boundary of our yellow zone, and it's dividing yellow zone from red zone. AT2 marks a shift in metabolic fuel source from a mix of fat and carbs, glycogen, lactate below AT2 to primarily anaerobic glycolysis of glycogen above AT2. And some key points of that fuel source and that metabolic pathway is that it gives us really fast production of ATP, but it does so with a large amount of lactate being produced. Above AT2, lactate production exceeds the muscle's clearing ability. It rises unsustainably, and the effort can only be held for a few seconds to a few minutes. And this is our second marked increase in physiological response with increasing exercise workload. And so, gang, don't be confused if you see different names describing these thresholds. A first ramp up is your first threshold. A second ramp up is your second threshold. So if they were using lactate, if they were measuring breathing rate, if they were measuring heart rate, they may have different terms. So lactate threshold 1, lactate threshold 2. Oh, they used a lactate to measure the first ramp up and the second ramp up. A ventilatory threshold 1 and 2, they used breathing rate. They're different metrics to measure the same thing. Is it on the first ramp up or the second ramp up? So, gang, this is recorded in November of 2024, and I've just wrapped up a 9-visit, 6-week study at the Human Performance Lab, and I'm going to do a separate video with all my full data metrics and take-home messages for you guys. So that's going to be a separate video, but I just wanted to show, I snapped a photo here of the PhD students' notes during a lactate ramp test or and I just wanted to highlight a few things for you here, just to show these two ramp ups. And so on the right here, I have green, yellow, and red. And then if we move to the left of that, we see two columns, and she was using two different lactate meters. And so we can see at 125 watts, 150, 175, 200, 225, 250, etc. That was cycling power. And then we can see lactate concentration between the two separate lactate meters. And so basically quite steady state here. So the one lactate meter, 0.8, 0.7, 3.9, that was an error. There must have been sweat in the sample, 0.8, 0.6, 0.9. Pretty steady state. That's green zone. And then, so they're around 1.3, 1.4 millimoles of lactate is when I reached my aerobic threshold. And a lot of scientific literature says 2 millimoles is absolutely your aerobic threshold. Well, for some people it is, for some it isn't. And then you can see that yellow zone there where my lactate has definitely increased, 2.1, 3.9, 3.5. But my body, my muscles are really doing all they can to clear and use that lactate as a fuel source. And then once I reach my AT2, or the dividing line between yellow and red, you can see how it just absolutely skyrockets. So 7.7 on one lactate meter, 5.8 on the other one. It just, compensation mechanisms are done, and it absolutely skyrockets. So as I say, I'll do a full separate video on my data, but just to give you guys a visual representation there. So most importantly, how do you monitor if you're in green, yellow, or red? There's many metrics, and in the laboratory, they look at as many as they can. They look at rate of perceived exertion, a breathing rate, heart rate, a lactate. They're analyzing your breath to see if you're using fat or carbs, and they look at all of those to say, okay, here's your thresholds. We aren't so lucky. We have to pick one or two metrics. But even still, it's good to look at as many metrics as possible, because just looking at one metric, it may be out in left field. So I view that, an analogy is like when I'm ski guiding, weather. I like to look at a lot of different weather forecasts, and I get an overall sense of what's happening. If I just looked at one data point, it might be out in left field. So if I were to only be able to use one metric for monitoring my zones, it would hands down be breathing. And we've gone through this. We don't need to rehash it. So nose breathing, mouth breathing, throughout the green, yellow, and red. We don't need to rehash that. I am still a massive fan of heart rate, and especially for shorter efforts, to stop you going too crazy on your green aerobic sessions. And go to alpineendurance.ca and go to the Get Started tab, and we have tests for how to see what your aerobic threshold AT1 heart rate is. And heart rate is excellent for shorter efforts, so roughly less than 2 hours. Using heart rate is great, is awesome. And I'm going to cut into a few examples here, and I'm also going to do a separate video on heart rate drift, because it's quite important. But simply put, the reason heart rate isn't good on long efforts is, on a long effort, your heart rate begins to separate from your work output, and your heart rate will increase over time. And there's many reasons for that. And as I say, separate video coming. But on hour 3, let's say, my heart rate will have increased for a given output as compared to what it would have been on hour 1. And so for those long efforts, it's important to check in with your breathing. And then for the yellow and red, when we're doing our sprint intervals, again, I like using breath, because heart rate will lag behind the effort we're doing. Let's say we're doing a 1 minute on, 1 minute off, red zone sprints. The effort we're putting out, it'll take our heart rate a little bit to actually tell us that intensity. So I use breath for the sprints as well. So again, what I wanted to talk about here is monitoring and evaluating if you've had a productive aerobic green zone training session. So here's what my Garmin watch has told me here after I did an outdoor cycling session. And looking at this, was this good green zone or not? So a textbook is that for our green sessions, we want to stay below our aerobic threshold. And our aerobic threshold is the top of zone 2, marking the dividing line between zone 2 and zone 3. So if I've gone into zone 3, that means I've gone above my aerobic threshold, which on paper is not good for an aerobic training session. However, let's go through two scenarios for this training session. So number one, your thresholds are not laser beam lines in the sand. So let's say that your aerobic threshold is 120 beats a minute. It's around there. It's not exactly there. And so what I would do here, even if you've gone just 121 or 122 beats a minute, your watch is going to count that as zone 3. But in reality, that's totally and completely fine. So I can't scroll up here because I've done a screenshot, but I would scroll up on my watch and you can see what your heart rate number actually spiked up to. And if it was only going up in the low 120s for this athlete who is me, that would be a totally fine, totally good green session. What would not be a good green session is if you scrolled and looked at your heart rate and saw that you were spiking up in the 140s and then back down, and spiking up in the 140s and back down. Blah, blah, blah. That would not be a good green session. You're going to be triggering the carbs and glycogen to be brought on board, and that would not be good. So take homes. AT1 is not a laser beam line in the sand. If you come home from a green workout like this and you see you were above that, basically how high above that did you go? A little bit above is totally fine. A lot above is not fine. And gang, so this is an example of heart rate drift on a long effort. So what we're looking at here is my Garmin after a 6-hour, 20-minute gravel cycling ride. And you can see here 3 hours and 42 minutes in zone 3. So you're saying, what the heck? Neil, you're full of crap. You told me that I had to be below my aerobic threshold in order to hold that pace for hours and hours. Well, I was. So I had a very lengthy chat with a PhD folks at the Human Performance Lab on heart rate drift. And I'm going to do a separate video on this. I got a bunch of papers to show you guys. So heart rate on long efforts is going to increase at a given output. And so you can still be in that fat burning aerobic threshold zone, even though your heart rate has increased. And so the reason I was able to be an hour and 42 minutes here in zone 3 is because I wasn't actually in zone 3. My heart rate was doing heart rate drift, or aerobic decoupling is another term for it. As I said, I'm going to do a whole video on this, but I don't want to keep you guys hanging, so I'll give you a little bit of info now. So the reason we have an increase in our heart rate on long efforts, 3 main reasons. One, dehydration. And so our blood plasma volume is reducing and it gets thicker, turns into more jello. And our heart has to pump more in order to get the blood to move through our body. The second one is thermoregulation. So usually, not always, but we start to get hotter and hotter during a ride, and our body needs oxygen to go to our muscles, and it also needs blood to go to our skin surface in order to cool us down. And so that results in the heart rate increasing. And the last but not least, which is quite interesting, is heart rate variability. And I've got a very cool paper on this. So much like any other stress, like a life stress, your heart rate variability decreases and you undergo stress during a long effort. Heart rate variability decreases and there's less time for your ventricles to fill with blood. And so therefore they have to pump faster to get the same amount of blood going on. So in conclusion here, long effort, don't stress if it looks like you were above your aerobic threshold. You weren't. And also, this is hammering home why on long efforts, we also need to check in with our breathing and not just our heart rate to see if we're at threshold or not. Well, if you made it this far, super grateful for your attention span. Always happy to answer questions, you guys. alpineendurance.ca. Happy training.